Alex Wendt is the man behind the Prague Vitruvius, a very impressive and useful website dedicated to the city's architecture. Indeed, the Englishman, who works as head of communications at Prague College, probably knows a lot more about the Czech capital's buildings and history than the vast majority of natives. In the first part of our tour of his Prague, Alex gives me some fascinating insights into Moskewska Street, the main drag in his Vršovice neighbourhood, beginning across the street from a mansion known as the Rangerka.
Well, this really is my part of the world. I work in Vinohrady, but this is what they call the poor man's Vinohrady. Vršovice, once a village, and then in the 1920s incorporated into the city of Prague. And we're really here right now at the hub of the old town.
And this church beside us is St. Nicholas Church, the same name as, I guess there are a few St. Nicholas churches in Prague.
I think there are 3 altogether. This one's special because it has a very old statue of John Nepomuk outside, which I think is even older maybe than most of the church. But this church actually features in The Good Soldier Schweik. There's a humorous scene at the beginning where Schweik tracks down a missing field altar, which he's supposed to be using in a communion service. And it was secreted in an old sofa that was then sold by a retired teacher to the vicar of this church. So this is our claim to fame.
And I know you also want to speak about this building across the street here, which is now a Česká spořitelna bank.
Yeah, and it always was a bank. And it's actually one of the most fabulous kind of Art Nouveau buildings, built by pretty much the same team who just finished work on Obecný dům in Náměstí Republiky. When that was finished, they came and worked on this. So that's a pretty splendid piece. And then just opposite, on the corner, we have it's called the Vršovické Chateau or Zamek, and it's originally a silk factory which was built by 2 enterprising Italians around the end of the 18th century. And then when the bottom fell out of the silk market in Prague, it was converted and it was used variously as a town hall, as a drying out centre for alcoholics, particularly those returning from the war. And now it's been splendidly restored as, I think, an old people's home. And it's known as the Rangerka, after the Rangeri brothers who built the original silk factory.
Now we've walked perhaps 100 metres from the St. Nicholas Church to the Husovzbor, or Hus House, I think it's called in English.
Yes, this was built in the 1930s. It's a striking bit of modernist architecture. And it was built at around the same time as a lot of the other functionalist churches in this area. The one in Jiřího Poděbrad was built in 1928. The one at the end of this street that we'll see later was also built at that time. And then this one joined it in 1930. And in common with 1 or 2 other churches, rather unusually, they actually built a community theatre into the church. It's one of the nice things about Prague, I find, that the community is so well looked after. And perhaps here in Vršovice most of all, because this was, as I said, originally a village in its own right. So this is where people would have come for entertainment at the turn of the century. And the plot of land that the church is built on used to have a smithy, Kovarna, and it's called Na Kovarně still, this area. And you may have heard some of the trams in the background, and this is, of course, where the first horse-drawn trams used to go from in Prague, right into the town centre from Na Kovarně.
Any particular reason why they started here?
Absolutely no idea at all.
Also, this church or church building is unusual in having a bank in the front of it.
It does. Well, there we go. Bank, theatre. The whole life revolved around this place.
And now, Alex, we've come a little bit further down Moskewska and we're outside a restaurant called Stella Cafe Ristorante.
Yeah, good old Italian name. This used to be called Palackého, this street, a long time before the communist takeover, I guess. And the interesting thing about the Stella, which has a pretty unprepossessing look to it, is that at one time it was the number on Palackého where Jaroslav Hašek actually lived. And he lived here about a year before he started writing The Good Soldier Schweik. So we can imagine that this is probably where the seed was born.
You know what? These writers lived in so many places. So it's my impression that both he and Kafka, they must have had about 25 homes between them.
Yeah, I think so. And you certainly see busts of Hašek all over Prague. But oddly enough, not here. There's not a plaque to memorialise him.
How do you know this?
It was a long time ago. I was doing some research on the area for a blog I used to keep about Vršovice called Vršovice Daily Photo. No longer extant, but if you want to look at it, the photos are still there.
So now, Alex, we've come to, I guess, the end of the kind of main strip of Moskewska. Where are we now? What's in front of us here?
We're actually looking at a very unusual and rather hidden building. It's nowadays a contemporary art gallery, Galeria 10, but it was built originally by a man called Valdez, so it's also known as the Valdesovo Museum. And he was, as far as I recall, the founder of the Kohinoor company, which still has its factory located just around the corner on Vršovická. It's famous principally because its logo was designed by František Kupka. But as far as I know, it's still in production, producing buttons, press studs, fasteners of all kinds.
Pencils too, no? It's just my imagination.
It's a different company, strangely enough. I think the other Kohinoor was originally a České Budějovice company that moved here. But as far as I know, they're not connected.
And across the street from us is what some, I guess, would consider a monstrosity.
Yes, there was originally a very large communal graveyard here for the village of Vršovice. And in the 1920s, at the time when the village became part of Greater Prague and new buildings extended outwards, they moved the bodies, presumably, and decided to build on this sloping land a modernist church. It's the Church of St. Wenceslas. It's very notable. It's probably one of the more famous buildings of Josef Gočár, who perhaps is more famous for his Cubist-style architecture, the House of the Black Madonna, for example, in the old town of Prague. And it's difficult to imagine, really, that only a few years after completing that commission, he created this extraordinarily forward-looking slab of white, or column of white stone for this community.
From the corner opposite the Gočár Church, we head back towards the city centre, to part of Vršovice that's become extremely fashionable in recent years. At the centre of that transformation has been one of Prague's greatest spots for a beer or coffee, Café Sladkovsky. Alex Wendt has been coming here since it opened its doors 4 years ago.
Well, I suppose it's what in England you would call my local. I try to come here as often as I can. It's not as much as I used to, but it's very convenient for where I live. It's right on the corner, always a good place to have your restaurant or cafe. And in very many ways, just as Vršovice itself and Moskewska, where we walked, is that kind of hub for the community. So this is the real social centre of this little part of town.
Also, I know they cook in this place. How would you rate the food here?
They do. I think it's exceptional. And they're very lucky to have had one or two really good chefs over the last few years. My girlfriend's Lebanese, and she really enjoys the falafel menu. They have, I know everywhere says they have very good burgers, but my burger expert friend tells me that these really are very good.
What kind of people come here?
Well, just around the corner from here, many years ago, there was Shakespeare and Sons, which had the great advantage of being an expat bookshop and bar. This doesn't have the bookshop, but it has the bar, and it still attracts a great many of the expat community as well as Czechs, and that's one of the great joys of living in this particular area of town. There's a really nice blend of nationalities, and everyone amazingly seems to get on well with each other.
You've been in Vršovice several years. The area has, as everyone knows, changed a lot over the years. How have you viewed those changes?
I've seen them happening very gradually, incrementally, but there's still the spirit of the place. It's still a slightly grungy, slightly down at heel feel to the place, which is really good. I know Katarzyna, who runs this place, has said in previous interviews that she feels slightly afraid of encroaching gentrification, and I'm glad to say we don't feel that too much.
And apart from Sladkovsky, where would you go for a drink in this area?
There's a good little restaurant around the corner, Tramtarie. There's Café Vlese, which took over from Shakespeare's. Apart from that, almost every street has some kind of drinking hole, which is wonderful to dive into now and again.
And is it possible to talk about a typical Vršovice denizen?
Vršovicans tend to be well-educated, interesting people, outgoing. Half of them would probably disagree with that last bit, but there's a great sense of welcome that you always get. and always have had in this area of town. I think the fact that it's kind of on the outskirts and yet part of Prague is very important for that.
I've said this before in my Prague. I think many of the areas that are quite close to the centre have improved in recent years, like Letna, like Karlin. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, you still fall down the occasional pothole, but they've kept the cobbled streets here, which is wonderful. I don't know for how much longer. As I said before, I really like the fact that it combines, gradual development with a certain hanging on to the past. There's a real sense of heritage living around here. It's a wonderful experience.